This is the 15th um, installment of this series and history. And today we're going to be speaking about the emergence of Israel. Just to recapitulate, the Jewish people's, the beginning of our history is related and connected with the land of Israel, the beginning of Abraham Avinu and the promise that Hashem made always to the Jewish people. Unfortunately, for the last 2,000 years, we have been away from the land, with very small exceptions and only a few communities here and there. The majority of the Jewish people live outside of Israel. But we never lost the desire to return. But it became impossible and impractical. Nachmanides, and other people started, to come. Yehuda Levi, Hossein Asiya had even thought about invading Israel with some soldiers. But Israel was with the Christians, with the Crusades, with the eventually the Ottoman Empire, and the Jews were never able to. And the land of Israel also in itself was abandoned. I want to quote a famous quote from Mark Twain, who visited, the American author, who visited Israel in 1867, and in his book Innocents Abroad, he describes the land of Israel. 1867. We traversed some. Remember that the Bible had said that Hashem was going to make, when the Jewish people leave, the city, the country will be desolate. And Nachmanides Ramban explains that the reason for this, or the blessing in it, is that because it was a desert, because it was unattractive, nobody would want to conquer it. And this is where Mark Twain writes: we traversed some miles of desolate country. We only saw weeds, a desolation that is not even imagination can grace. We never saw in the entire trip a human being in the whole route. We went towards Jerusalem, and the more rocky and bare and repulsive the landscape became, there was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. No landscape exists that is more tiresome to the eye than that which bounds the approaches to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is mournful, dreary, and lifeless. I would not desire to live here. It is a hopeless, heartbroken land. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. This is what Israel was in the middle of the 19th century. However, one of the great, during the 19th century, as we discussed last time, partly because of anti-Semitism, partly because of the pogroms in Russia, and partly because the Jews realized that they would never be, with the emancipation and with the Enlightenment, the Jews were always going to be aliens in the country where they were. There was a great movement of Jews to try to start the concept of the return to the land of Israel. And there are some important people. I just want to mention a few. I brought a little, the screen, the names of some important people. Moses Hess, a man who thought that the best solution for the Jewish people was to assimilate, forget Judaism. And he realized that it couldn't happen. Moses Hess actually is called the Red Rabbi because he was essentially a communist in some way. He's called the Red Rabbi. Karl Marx mentions Moses Hess. The difference is that while Marx had other ideas, Hess started the concept of the Jewish people returning to create its own state. Leo Pinsker, Auto Emancipation, another book. Jews could not wait for anybody else to give them freedom and rights. They had to do it themselves. There was an organization created in 1870, Bilu, the initials in Hebrew of Bet Israel Lechu Venelcha, from Yeshayahu, Bet Israel, come, get up, and let's go to the land of Israel. An organization called Chovet Zion that started to organize trips and settlements in Israel. Some of them in places that were infested with malaria, and they created colonies there. And some of the great philanthropists like Edmund Rothschild was helping them, Rosh Pinah, Zichron Yaakov. Many of these people were had relatives in Europe who are telling them, "What are you doing? That you're this is a deathly place. Your children are dying, people are dying. This is something you need to make sure that you don't you begin to live with um, with more get away from this land," and they did not. Um, Another person who helped a great deal in this moment was Moses Montefiore, who was a very wealthy man, and he started to help the Jews who were settling in Israel. Um, One of the great things that he did, besides helping Jews in every way, he was created the first neighborhood in Jerusalem outside of the city walls of Jerusalem, called Yemin Moshe Montefiore. Um, so during this period of time, at the end of the 19th century, you see a lot of people beginning to go. By 1891, between 1882, which is the beginning of what we call the first Aliyah, first mass migration of Jews, organized especially by Russian Jews or Romanian Jews, Bilu, 28 new settlements are created in 10 years, 9 years, 28 new settlements in the land of Israel. The land was purchased from Arab landowners. Never, there was not an invasion. Everything was deeded. There were two financial organizations, the Jewish Colonial Trust and the Keren Kayemet Israel, that were collecting money and helping buying these lands. But unbeknownst or hardly aware of all these developments, this young, handsome journalist witnessed the anti-Semitism and the Dreyfus trial in Paris, and he was convinced that that the Jewish people could only be safe in a state of its own. And he creates this incredible book called Der Judenstaat in 1896, and which transform him into a leading personality in this new movement called the Zionist movement. In 1897, he convenes in Basel, in Switzerland, the first Zionist conference. There were 197 delegates from 16 countries who formulated the initial Zionist policy. Herzl wrote in his diary after the first meeting, and I quote, "Were I to sum up the Basel Congress in one word, which I shall guard against pronouncing publicly, it would be this: at Basel, I founded the Jewish state. Perhaps in 5 years, but certainly in 50, everyone will know it." This was written in 1897. And 50 years later, May 14, 1948, the state of Israel that he dreamed became a reality. Unfortunately, he did not live to see it happen. He died at the age of 44 of a heart attack. And the tragedy is apparently one of these. He had suggested that if we couldn't go to Palestine, let's go somewhere else. And he suggested somebody's offer Patagonia in Argentina. Others suggested Uganda in Africa. The conference was so much against it that some people say that he had a heart attack from the controversy. Jews did not, they wanted a state, but nowhere in the world except in the land of Israel. He meets with sultans and chancellors and the Pope to try to create a momentum towards idea. And in reality, he is very, very fortunate. He does create the momentum, because after he dies, Max Nordau continues his work, and the Jewish people are moving in that direction. A man who is very influential in this movement is Chaim Weizmann. You have to remember that Herzl's, when he thought of the idea of a Jewish state, people thought he was crazy. The famous line, "Im tirtzu en zo agada." If you will it, if you work for it, it's not going to be a myth. People thought he was Shabtai Tzvi, a crazy dreamer. Others saw him as a Messiah, as somebody who really was going to bring about the redemption of the Jewish people. So after he died, the concept did not die, and it continued. Now, in Weizmann, we come to a very interesting development that is the first opening of making the dream of returning to the land of Israel a reality. Chaim Weizmann was a biochemist, and he, from Russia, he comes to England to teach biochemistry in the University of Manchester. In the university, he discovers he's the first time he discovered the creation of artificial acetone, a very important component that enables the creation of smokeless gunpowder. This helped the British war effort, and for which he became friendly with many of the politicians. One of them, famous politician and foreign minister, was Lord Arthur Balfour. In 1917, Balfour, when England gets the right to govern that area called Palestine, the mandate for Palestine, Balfour writes a letter that the government of England, His Majesty's government, sees with favor the establishment of, in the land of Palestine, of a homeland, for a national homeland for the Jewish people. This declaration, on November 2, 1917, was received in the Jewish people as one of the happiest days in the life of the Jewish people, and especially for 2,000 years. People rejoiced. Unfortunately, the British eventually regretted that decision and did a lot of things to undo that decision, as we will discuss later on. One of the issues that we have to understand is that when the mandate of Palestine was composed, was the entire Palestine was on two sides of the Jordan, what we call today Jordan, and the West Bank and the land of Israel, the state of Israel. So the Palestine was from the Mediterranean Sea to Iraq, what we call Iraq. And that was supposed to be for the Jewish people. When in 1922, the British, who had to arrange a place for the Hashemites, who had been expelled from the Mecca by the Saudis expelled the Hashemites. The Hashemites have nowhere to go. And they had been helpful to the British. So the British says, okay, we're going to give them the eastern side of Palestine, something that the Jabotinsky, for example, was always opposed. But unfortunately, that becomes Jordan. Now, let me just discuss a couple of things about people in the Jewish, in the Zionist movement that we should know. And I put it here as so we have the names clearly. Max Nordau was the first president following Herzl. Chaim Weizmann was the president after that. He dies in 1952. He is a famous scientist and whose name the Weizmann Institute is in Rehovot, where he actually lived. David Ben-Gurion was a political leader of the Jewish community in Israel, in the land of Palestine, particularly more with the labor side, the kibbutzim, the secular people, and he created, a defense for the communities called the Haganah. Jabotinsky represents a different kind of perception. He's more what we call a more revisionist, a tougher stance against the British. And he is going to be inspiring the creation of an organization called the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, the Etzel. Other important leaders in this group are Asher Ginsberg Achad Am, who really was not very influential in the creation of the state of Israel. He was more a philosopher who talked about the creation of a Jewish center for the Jewish people, more of a spiritual. Another important person in this area is Avram Kook, the famous Orthodox rabbi who became the chief rabbi of Israel. And it was very important for Rabbi Kook, who became a very, very great proponent of Zionism. But so many other Haredim were opposing the secular Zionists. Avram Kook was very in favor of them. Another person very important in the creation of these colonies, I mentioned to you that by 1930, there are 68 kibbutzim and 71 moshavim in the land of Israel. Israel was producing, creating what happened between the death of Herzl and 1930-39 was a miracle. I mean, we are not talking about just agricultural settlements. We're talking about a Tel Aviv that begins to grow as a major center. Intellectuals coming to Israel, creating the Hebrew University, which, by the way, at the opening university, even Balfour himself was present. There were newspapers, there were orchestras, the industry, the idea of potash, the chemicals from the Dead Sea. Israel was the Jewish community in Israel was producing in a miraculous form. The Arabs were so angry with this and started to attack the Jewish people, attack the kibbutzim, kill people. In 1929, the Hafti, the Amin Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, incites riots. People come in Hebron, they kill 67 people, they enter yeshivot, they cut the throat of the students. The view of what happened, the description of what happened there was atrocious. And because of this, the British government realizes that there's tension in the Jewish people's work in Israel, and so they try to limit the immigration. And there's a famous white paper, which is exactly the opposite of what the Balfour Declaration was. Instead of saying this is going to be the national homeland of the Jewish people, the Jews are second-class citizens, if at all. It is interesting that although Britain was organizing so many terrible things in London, in Parliament, in Israel, in Palestine itself, the representative of the British government was a Jew, Herbert Samuel, the High Commissioner for Palestine, who he needed to strike a balance between being, on the one hand, a British representative, and the other hand, a practicing Jew. It was a difficult time for him. So this is what happened in this period of time, from 1910 to 1930 or 35. A very important point that I want to discuss is when the Jewish immigration is stopped, Jews try to break the blockade. And the blockades continue even after the Second World War. The British do not let the Jews come in. In one of the declarations, Jabotinsky, in front of the British commissioners, British government, he says something very famous. He says, I don't understand why you think that we want too much. What we want is what belongs to us, what is right, and what is necessary. And he says, we need a state of the Jews because we need to save millions, many millions of Jews. This he said in the 1930s. He understood, he had a prophetic vision that Europe was going to be, the Holocaust was going to happen. In fact, he went in Europe giving lectures in synagogues, Vladimir Jabotinsky, telling people, you must move to Israel. This is going to be the end. And unfortunately, Jews did not listen to him. The Orthodox world rejected Zionism, except for some in the religious movement, in the religious Zionists, like the Mizrahi, or this Rabbi Avraham Kook, who was the leader of the religious Zionists, who was very much in favor of the establishment of Jews in Israel. But unfortunately, the, the concept that the Jews are going to be limited in access to Israel was a terrible thing by the British. The Arabs, on the other hand, like Husseini, they were hoping for the Nazis to, just like they were you're going to kill Jews in Europe, they're going to come into Israel, and they're going to kill them too, and we're going to be free. We'll discuss in a moment. Actually, Husseini actually goes to Berlin to meet Hitler, as we know. So when the Jews notice that they are limited in what they could do, the Jews do two things. Number one, they create attacks on the British, especially led by the Etzel, the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, the famous attack on King David Hotel in 1946, to let the British get out of Israel. By the way, just to clarify this, they did not want to kill anybody, although many were killed. They put bombs and they notify the people, get out, because they're going to be a bomb. They thought this was phony. They never listened, and more than 70 people were killed. But this was the way in which the Jews were reacting. Some of them were executed by the British. Begin himself was in a sense, the heir to the Jabotinsky group, Menachem Begin, who comes to Israel in 1941. He is the creator of this Irgun Tzvai Leumi, the Etzel. He has to hide from the British because if they catch him, they're going to kill him. Not just Jabotinsky himself was put in prison for many years until there was an amnesty. So when the Jews notice that there is attempt to stop them from building, what do? They build more. And that is when I point out very important story. They build in 1939 to show that the Zionist project would continue. They create 12 new settlements in the same year. 12 new settlements in 1 year. And 7 of them in one day, May 25th, 1939. The Jews have a beautiful community that we created. If you think about it, from 1900 to 1939, less than 40 years, the Jewish people are, the state is really, you could see the state being created. Many of these communities were suffering from many attacks. They needed to create organizations to defend themselves. The very famous organization was created by this man, Joseph Trumpeldor, who comes to help a community in the north of Israel called Tel Chai. I mentioned this as a model of Jews from outside of Israel who come and they help the community. He is killed in 1920 in a horrible attack. His famous last words were, Tov lamut be'ad artzenu. It is good that I give my life on behalf of this of our land. Another important person in this picture that I want to mention is Eliezer ben Yehuda, who not only they were, building universities and newspapers and armies and agricultural settlements and industry, but it's also the development of the Hebrew language. Eliezer ben Yehuda made a vow. He was a student of medicine in Paris when he realized he wanted to go to Israel, make Aliyah. And when he made the Aliyah, he made a vow that he will never speak any other language except Hebrew. He was such a fanatic for the Hebrew language. He created a dictionary. His children, write the story of how difficult it was to communicate with the palace because they couldn't speak the Hebrew language. And so these are the kinds of people who actually created Israel. The dream of Herzl was realized by the sacrifice of Jews from Russia escaping from the pogroms, by the idealism of people coming, like a lawyer like Ben Gurion, or a poet like Jabotinsky, or a chemist like Chaim Weizmann. All of these people coalescing in this beautiful place. However, I just want to point out there are 500,000 Jews in the community in Israel in 1939. So we have in Europe Hitler, the Nazis, speaking about destruction of the Jewish people, attacking and entering Israel and perhaps destroy the Jewish community. So by 1939, it seemed that the fate of this small Jewish community, only 500,000 strong, abandoned by the British government that had renounced on its promises and its obligations to them, and surrounded by millions and millions of Arab enemies bent on destroying Israel and hoping that the Nazis would win. It seemed as if the fate of the Jewish community was sealed, and so was the dream of Herzl. However, Hashem did not allow the dream to die, and a miracle occurred, and the Jewish people survived, and the state of Israel was able to be born. And that will be the subject for the next week, the next class. It is appropriate, perhaps, today that we are in the eve of Hanukkah, that very often the Jewish people appear to be on the brink of destruction, when it appears that everything is against us, and that the Jewish people are come to an end. And Hashem saves us and doesn't allow the destruction of the Jewish people. In Hanukkah too, it appears as if the Greeks were going to conquer everything, then the Jews were going to assimilate, and Judaism was going to end. And the miracle of Hanukkah is that it did not end. So I hope, Mr. Hashem, that we should all remember the kindness that Hashem has given us throughout our history, not allowing us to be destroyed.